Folks, welcome to Lecture 3 in this 8-part lecture series on New Testament Christology. In this third lecture, we're going to talk about the context of Greco-Roman philosophy and paganism. In the first lecture, we talked a bit about the last couple of hundred years of critical study of the depiction of Jesus, his person, and his work in the 27 books of the New Testament, and the way in which scholars have thought about that, expounded that, discussed that in the last couple of hundred years in critical New Testament scholarship. In the second lecture, we talked about the context of exclusivist Jewish monotheism, the way in which the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition was quite distinctive in the wider Mediterranean world for expounding and adhering to a view in which there really was only one supreme being in the universe. Of course, they believed in exalted angels. Of course, they had various exalted patriarchs. And of course, they had messianic speculation of various sorts, all of which contextualizes the life, the mission, the message of Jesus, and the way in which Jesus is depicted vis-a-vis the one God of Israel, Yahweh, and vis-a-vis humanity. So the depiction of Jesus in the New Testament, his person and work, is contextualized by its context, or by the context of exclusivist Jewish monotheism. I argued in the last lecture that though some scholars say, and have said for a number of years, that, well, the Jewish tradition really wasn't that much more exclusive than some other traditions. I mean, take the Greek pantheon with Zeus at the top, the high god, and lots of other gods underneath him. Really, the Jewish tradition of Yahweh, the high god, but the angels below him, very exalted, sometimes even called sons of God, B'nai Elohim, in the Jewish tradition, sometimes even called Elim or Elohim or whatever. That's the Hebrew and Aramaic equivalent in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These figures are really very exalted, and that conception of Jewish monotheism, with the one God of Israel, Yahweh, and subordinate to him, all of these very exalted figures, is really not unlike the Greek pantheon or the later Roman pantheon, which was partly an adaptation of that Greek pantheon. I think that this is wrong. I think that when you study the relevant texts and traditions, you can see that while Zeus is exalted and supreme, all the other gods, in a sense, belong within the same metaphysical and ontological category as him. Whereas, when you see the Jewish tradition, and this gets more complex before the exile, where there's some evidence of belief in a couple of gods, where there's evidence of idolatry, but especially with the exile and thereafter, I think that you begin to see a much more robust statement that there is one supreme being in the universe, Israel's God Yahweh, the creator and sustainer of all, distinct in kind and not just degree from all other reality, even the most exalted of his representative angels or other figures that are depicted in relevant Jewish texts and traditions, such that the rise of Christology, viewing Jesus of Nazareth in his person and in his work as truly divine, and then of course also as truly human, ought to be seen as a distinctive development without full precedent in the wider Greco-Roman world, without full precedent in the Jewish tradition, even though it must make sense within that tradition for it to work as history. So we talked a bit about that, but okay, so that's the Jewish monotheism. What about the wider context within which the Christology, which needs to make sense within the Jewish monotheism, what about the wider context of that, of Greco-Roman philosophy and paganism? I don't want to say too much about that. I want to keep this lecture to a reasonable length, but I want to highlight a few things for you to be thinking about. The tradition of Greek philosophy becomes massively important for reflection on the person of Jesus in his pre-existent state, in his incarnate state, in his glorified state, and the way in which Jesus, as depicted in the New Testament and in subsequent Christian theological tradition and reflection, relates to the one God and relates to humanity, the full divinity of Jesus, the full humanity of Jesus. For the Christians, to expound that in ways which satisfied them philosophically and theologically and conceptually, as early as Paul the Apostle, and I can talk about this in subsequent lectures, but even more so in the second, third, and fourth centuries, and especially coming to a particular climax with the Nicene Creed in 325 and with the Chalcedonian definition in 451 AD. There was a need not just to use the theological and devotional and conceptual resources of the Jewish monotheistic tradition, which emphasized the oneness of Israel's God, the unity of that God over against all of the reality. But if the Christians were going to expound the person of Jesus as somehow intrinsic to that one God, and yet not collapse the Father and the Son into one kind of person without a distinction. And of course, the Spirit comes in as a question later in the full Trinitarian formulation. But if you're not going to collapse the Father and the Son, then you need some linguistic and conceptual resources in order to make those tight and nuanced distinctions within the Godhead. And the Christians were much assisted in those distinctions, in that philosophical reflection, by their modest appropriation of Greek philosophical categories. So I don't want to say that much about the Greek philosophical context, but I will say a few things. Greek philosophy pre-existed Socrates, which is a philosopher that has his influence in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, and then he has his famous student Plato, and then Plato has his famous student Aristotle. So that's the Athenian philosophical tradition there in the home of Athens, Greece. There were philosophers before that, but we're just going to focus on some major schools which exercised influence down to the early Christian period, which partly contextualizes the rise, origins, and shape of Christology. You have the Epicurean tradition, which grows out of an ancient Greek philosopher named Epicurus. And let's just focus on some of the basic things. Epicurus was what we might call a proto-Darwinian, a proto-deist. His philosophy, his cosmology view of the universe basically goes something like this. Yes, there are divine beings, perhaps multiple of them, but they're a long, long way away. They enjoy their own divine, immaterial lives in peace. We exist on this planet a long way from them, and the planet operates under its own naturalistic steam. The atoms swerve and bump against one another and make all sorts of interesting formations, including human beings, and the natural world as we know it kind of evolves under its own steam and under its own power. Again, I call this a kind of a proto-Darwinianism, if you like. So that was the Epicurean view. The Platonic view, issuing mostly from Plato but influencing all kinds of philosophers after that, was really a kind of philosophical monotheism in a sense. It was, and Plato has various ways of saying this, and I don't want to attempt to over-systematize him, but he has this belief or this articulation that there is a world beyond sense perception that is immaterial, that is a higher order of ontology and reality than this world, and it is the divine source of this world, and it is the uncreated reality, the supreme being, the being beyond being, in a sense, from which created reality gets its existence. And sometimes Plato articulates this in such a way that it sounds as though it's a kind of monotheism. Okay, so you have what I said, the Epicurean tradition, the Platonic tradition. There are other traditions we could talk about, Cynicism, Pythagoreanism, distinction, the various adaptations that Aristotle makes. I won't get into that. I'll just mention one more, the Stoic tradition. After all, round about the time of the rise of Christianity, the two most influential traditions were not Pythagoreanism, Cynicism, Epicureanism. It was Stoicism and then various forms of Platonism, which scholars call Middle Platonism for that period in between early Platonism and New Platonism. So I'll say a bit about Stoicism, then I'll say that Stoicism and Middle Platonism really contextualize the origins of Christianity, the first century wider philosophical context. Stoicism is a kind of monotheism, again, though that's somewhat of an oversimplification, but it's the belief that all reality, even divine reality, is something material. The divine is of a greater essence and of a pure essence, but material nonetheless, and the universe has come into being when that pure essence, that divine energy, that fire, that spirit, whatever, Stoics call it different things, have formed the rest of materiality into the kind of stuff that it is: plants, animals, humans, etc. But Stoicism kind of articulates something like a monotheism, but without anything like the sophisticated emphasis on the totally other, immaterial, non-contingent, immovable, omnipotent, all-knowing, etc. theology of Platonism and Middle Platonism. This somewhat contextualizes the rise of Christianity, and it's important to note that when Christianity begins and when it grows out of Jewish monotheism, and when you have people like Paul or others running about the Greco-Roman world saying there really is only one God, there was something like a high culture philosophical context for that monotheism. Of course, that monotheism might have rejected some of the traditions in the Old Testament, might have rejected that the one God of the universe ought to be equated with Yahweh of the Old Testament, but that there was a high cultured, what we might call philosophical monotheism, is something with which we have to do business when we think about the origins of Christology. So, and it contextualizes why it would be that in the second, third, and fourth centuries, really high culture philosophical thinkers like Origen of Alexandria, and earlier before him, Philo of Alexandria, who was not a Christian, would have warmed to these kind of this kind of view that, yeah, the pagan tradition, which is very old and much more widespread with many gods, it's wrong. There's just one supreme God. Partly, the wider Greco-Roman world was primed for that by the influence of Platonic monotheism. Okay, a bit about the context of paganism. I need to say far less about this. Other than Jewish monotheism, by and large, the wider Greco-Roman world was characterized by a belief in many gods that competed, that challenged one another, that were responsible for the ebbs and flows of the universe, etc. And the context of Jewish monotheism was quite distinctive in relation to that widespread pagan polytheism. So when Paul goes round about the Greco-Roman world and announces that there's only one God, that might have gotten something of a hearing among high culture philosophical thinkers, but the general public, as it were, would have warmed much more to a message about many and multiple gods. And so this is the context within which we need to think about the origins of Christology, the depiction of Jesus in the New Testament, the worship of Jesus in the New Testament, etc. And I look forward to giving this next lecture. I hope you enjoyed this one.